search for the word participant.
Okay.
That gives you the number of participants minus chairs.
Okay.
Oh yeah, search user. Okay, you could search for participant. Interesting.
Okay, I think we are actually, it's time to get going. Are we ready, Michael?
Are you going to play on the keyboard behind you during the meeting?
No, it's not mine, it's my daughter's, so you don't want me playing there, don't worry.
Does it have an ASDF model?
Sorry?
It's a thing. Is it an Internet of Things?
Yeah. It has Ethernet and things, but honestly, I haven't hooked it up to anything yet. It was recently purchased by the family, or for my youngest daughter. Anyway, so it's now 1 o'clock in Europe here, and 12 UTC. So I think we should get going, and we will let people trickle in as we go along. Welcome to the ASDF working group meeting at IETF 110. It's Niklas Odell here, and my co-chair is Michael Richardson, who you see in the other picture. Can you change slides? Next slide, please. Okay. This is an IETF meeting. Here is the short note. Well, the long one is coming on the next page. Briefly, you can go back to the previous one. I think it has the you will be recorded. Remember to be nice and be professional, and remember that IPR, the IETF IPR guidelines are in effect. And there you have links to our GitHub repo where you can file all agendas and so on, and also the notes for this particular meeting. And those notes will, of course, also end up in the repo eventually. Good. Next slide, please. And so here's the full note. Well, I hope you've read it. If not, read it at your convenience. Next slide, please. This is the agenda for today. We start out with an introduction, admin stuff, agenda bashing, and so on. We will say a few words about who we have been talking to with this working group, since this is largely about building things from the wider community. We will say a few words about the hackathon outcome that we had last week, and then we will move on to the actual specification work and the update there, and the consensus call for SDF 1.1. We'll do a bit of planning for upcoming virtual interims, and then we'll move on to the next features. So what will be in future versions of SDF? And there are a couple of lists there. So these the agenda was updated just before here, as we had some minor or some changes in the last minute. But this is also on data tracker now. Yeah. Next slide, please. The administrative stuff. There's a code EMD. There's a Meet Echo Jabber. All notes at the point there. We have so Michael is Jabber scribing and taking some notes. Ari is also helping out on the notes in code EMD. And I saw that Michael sent in the chat that please, if you want to speak up from Jabber, add Mick : at the start of your sort of point, so we don't miss it trying to navigate all these windows on our screens, simultaneous windows. Anyway, next slide, please. So these are just the working procedures for ASDF working group. We are using the same since the start. We keep our decisions on the mailing list, and but we do most of the work on GitHub. There's the link there, and we use an issue tracker on GitHub to actually track issues, which includes new features and fixes. So to follow this work, you need to both register for the mailing list as well as join our community on GitHub. And in addition to holding meetings at the sort of the face-to-face, the virtual face-to-face meetings, we also do a couple of virtual interims between the virtual physical meetings. And for these, we notify people on the mailing list, and then we typically do a doodle to ensure that we get find times that fit people's schedules. Next slide, please. So here is the status update. I immediately see an error here. We were chartered in October 2020. Obviously, this is not from the future. So we were chartered last October, and we had our first meeting at first virtual physical meeting at the 109 with a hackathon. And we had one interim before that and one interim after that. And where we are now is that we have a reasonably stable specification, what we will call the Asdf 1.1, which is on call of consensus. And I will come to why we call this Asdf 1.1 in a couple of slides. In addition to that, we had there was a hackathon event last week together with Wishy folks. I will also say a few words about that later, and where we basically talked about new features for Asdf. Meeting plans. Yeah, we will obviously meet today here, and then we will plan new meetings. And to be, unfortunately, there was some scheduling complexity around this meeting. I shouldn't say unfortunately, but we had requested a 1 hour meeting. Now we have a 2 hour meeting, and we are, of course, very grateful to that because we can have longer discussions. That was the outcome of sort of deconflicting other meetings. Anyway, next slide, please. So let's say a few words about the ASDF outreach. And the purpose of doing the ASDF work, which is basically developing the SDF specification, is of course to enable this vehicle of interoperability between data and information models coming from different organizations. And we have been doing some outreach. I realized now that I even missed a couple of things. There has been, we have talked to the Lightweight M2M group, SpecWorks. We have part of SDF is actually part of an ISO proposal, even if the specification is not even done yet for JTC1, SE41 on IoT. We have an ongoing collaboration with Web of Things. We have talked about other use cases where the setup of SDF can be useful, like electronic data sheets, textile manufacturing, and so on. I should also say that there was one DM was included in an IIC white paper on information models that was published 2 weeks ago. And we have been, and there is various other activities around doing blog posts and so on to promote the work. But the end message for this is, of course, that if you are part of an IoT organization that works with data models, we are happy to work with you and reach out to you and discuss where we can cooperate. Because the value of SDF will be dependent on how many, of course, implement it or cooperate with it. Yes, next slide, please. Yeah, so the IETF hackathon, that was last week. And as I said, this was a collaboration between folks in the ASDF working group and the folks in the Wishy activity of Things to Things research group. And we had it looks like we worked all week last week, but we had actually daily 1 hour sync meetings during the week where people discussed various topics. We had 7 people contributing, including 2 newcomers, one of which was a student. And the outcome was quite interesting. We had lots of exploratory discussions on new features. We talked about tools to do model translation and some collaboration with W3C, Web of Things. They also had a hackathon event last week. Next slide, please. So here is a bit more details on the discussions that were had on validating SDF 1.1, work on the semantic proxy, these tools, the thing maker, and so on, and then the mapping file concept. And Karsten will talk to this slide a lot more in the Things to Things research group tomorrow. But it's here for completeness. This is the kind of more concrete stuff they put into it.
It's this afternoon, not tomorrow.
Oh, sorry, apologies. I hope everybody heard that. Sorry, I'm a bit. I wasn't looking at my schedule. T2TRG is this afternoon, so you just have to wait like a couple of hours for this to. 4 hours from now, you will hear this slide again. Yes. Next slide, please. So, when we started this work in ASDF last year, we already came with a reasonably mature specification, which was marked as SDF 1.0. And the first objective of this working group was to take the specification, do as much quality improvement we could on that, and then add some features needed, and then call something in SDF 1.1. And we did that work, and there are some number of major changes on cross-referencing and reusing various other specifications from an SDF file, support for composite data types, and then a very long discussion on enumeration, choice, and so on. And with that, we thought we had something that we were happy with to call SDF 1.1 and mark as an implementation draft. Implementation draft is not sort of a formal IETF status, it should be noted. It's just a way to indicate that the particular specification is stable enough to serve as a basis, sort of intermediate basis until the final specification is done. So, and the reason for that is that we really need that in the one data model work, where we need to have a common specification to work against. Anyway, so we called for a call for consensus a couple of weeks ago, February 23rd. It concluded 2 days ago, and there were no objections raised. So we almost have an SDF 1.1. However, since we made this last call, there have been a couple of minor issues raised, and so they're not objections per se, but they are minor issues or sort of last call comments that we would like to address. So with that, you can go to the next slide. So Karsten, do you want to go through this?
Yes. So we had a pretty intensive couple of weeks working on SDF, and obviously a few things popped up. So there are 3 pull requests now that I'm proposing we put into the document before we publish it as 1.1. And the first thing is that there are some editorial things, IDNets and so on, but most importantly, the IDNet that is a gaping hole is the IANA consideration section for application/SDF plus JSON. And because this implementation draft is probably what should be referenced from the media type registry, it would be really good to have that IANA considerations section in there now, so we can go through all the gyrations of getting an early allocation and so on next. So I proposed that. No.
Go back.
I proposed that we apply this pull request. The second pull request came out of an observation last week in the hackathon that is, if you actually compose SDF from various pieces, which is something that people in the tool space want to do, it's really onerous that the info block is a required part of the syntax. Because when you have these various pieces and have them coming together, you have several info blocks, and the tool that is combining the pieces, which otherwise is a relatively simple thing, has to combine the info blocks. And in particular, since people are going to put dummy info blocks with empty strings or TBDs or whatever, you actually have to write code to discard the dummy info blocks. And even though the policy to have an info block is certainly something that we want to have in 1DM and other places, the mechanism really gets in the way when you are building SDF files from pieces. So pull request 24 makes the info block optional and adds some text there that explains this is not meant to make it optional in the sense of a policy, but it's just a change in the mechanism to simplify writing tools. And we have had a side discussion on whether just making the whole info block optional is enough, and we want to maybe make individual entries in the info block optional. I don't think that's needed, but we certainly can discuss that. We just should come to a conclusion really quickly on this one. And the third pull request came out of a desire to finally define scale minimum and scale maximum, which has been in the SDF spec since May 2020, but never was really defined. So it existed as an idea in Michael Koster's head, but and maybe he had told a few people so that they had something in their heads as well, but we didn't actually write this down. So we actually did this, and this led to pull request 22. But then with further work on these qualities, it actually turns out these things don't work the way they should. So at the time when scale min, scale max were invented at the beginning of last year, we hadn't really thought about combining models and mapping files. So the compositional aspect of these qualities wasn't really in the focus. So there was a lot of design space, and scale min, scale max used one corner of the design space that actually is not the right way to support combining models and mappings. So I have some detailed slides on that later. If there are questions, I can explain those slides beforehand. But I think the main observation here is we have invented something new, the mapping thing, and it turns out what the other thing that we never got around to fully describing doesn't actually do what we want. So since we won't get this fixed before we make 1.1 stable, the best option is probably to deprecate them, so formally to say these are in SDF 1.0, but not in SDF 1.1. And that's okay, because the models that are in the 1DM playground also are not using this yet, which is not surprising because it wasn't fully defined. Michael has some pull requests that actually do use this, and then the first one.next activity then will be coming up with the right quality so that these pull requests can be appropriately modified and they do what we want. But for SDF 1.1, we essentially should stop pretending that these qualities are there, because they haven't been fully defined, and in one.next we can put them in again. So that's a summary of the 3 pull requests. So none of these actually change the format, in the sense that the tools that are creating and consuming SDF have to change. Well, okay, they may have to cope with an optional info section, but that's probably not very onerous. But otherwise, there is no change in the format, and that's why we actually can merge this before publishing or without creating instability. And I think this would be a good point to have a little bit of discussion.
I think you're speaking to mute.
Sorry. I was on mute to keep you from hearing my drinking water.
I want to know, Karsten, but I was willing to wait about the merging issues with the scale min maximum. But I think you said you have slides later on for that.
If people want that, we can just continue in the agenda. It's like 10 slides on, and then come back to this, or we could just go ahead and make a decision now.
So, Ari?
Okay, so maybe a quick comment on all this. I guess the first one is rather obvious. Let's just do it. The following two are the one maybe a bit more discussion. And on the info block, yeah, I mean, as Carsten pointed out, I mean, it's as currently is there, you always need to have it. It's a bit onerous when you're doing these models, and then especially if it's full of TBDs, handling those, knowing when it actually is something you should be consuming and when it's not. It seems to be that the reasonable thing to be is to have it optional, and then when it is actually properly needed, you know, you can have your schema require it. For example, when you're contributing to the models to the world to be used. So I think they're making it optional makes sense, but I don't have a strong opinion on that. And the scale min max, maybe it's good to discuss with the details.
So one observation is that there is an Asdf linter that we use to run the playground through and so on. And that would be a tool that actually makes this required, because we don't want to have models in the playground where we don't know the license or who made that or which version it is. So the linter doesn't necessarily have to do exactly the same thing that the grammar does.
Okay. I see Michael Koster on the queue. Michael?
Oh,
Michael?
it looks like I'm unmuted. Okay, but I'm still in the queue. Okay, I can take myself in. There we go. So a couple of comments on the, I mean, I have more comments on the scale stuff, but we'll get into that later. On the info block, it seems like there's one useful feature that is a version which sort of advances with the date, which is a pretty simple thing that might be useful in the tool. But the main thing I wanted to point out was that during the early work in 1DM, we wanted a way to track everybody's contribution as we merged models, so the copyright would contain some sort of list of all the contributors. And so there's a bit of the process in the playground that we haven't really worked out about copyright tracking and for the license. But since it's since it's BSD 3 clause, it's not super important. Well, I guess it is, because it says that copyrights would be tracked. So there is a question about, you know, who owns the copyright of the merged model and how that gets tracked through the 1DM process. So whether we need extensive support in SDF for that or not, it seems like still an optional info block doesn't really get in the way of that.
I think that's a good point, and I agree that maybe we don't. I mean, I think this is probably. I guess the problem here is that if we keep it the way as is, I guess that there is not really spec support to actually do the kind of merging of copyrights and merging of licenses and so on, and how to actually process that. And that is probably something that takes a bit of investigation to get that right, to make it useful, I mean. And because probably one interesting thing here would of course be this kind of machine readable license and terms of use mechanism. But that sounds like that requires a bit more work, actually. So the question here is really, do we? I mean, we can either so if we take it from the top here, right? The first one is reasonably simple. The second one obviously has some aspects to it. There was a reason why this was made mandatory from the start, but maybe for now it's not so. Doesn't really break anything. The third one is technically more complicated, but so it's more of a time, but it's sort of not unsolvable, but it takes more time to spec it out. I mean, we can take the discussion now, or I think I would rather say that we postpone that discussion until SDF next and sort it out in the next major version, since this is not needed right now. And then we get it right in SDF next. But that's my proposed way of handling this. So we can basically finish this SDF 1.1 now, wrap it up, and have something robust there. Because otherwise, I think we'll be stuck in this cycle of finding problems and solving them and finding new problems and never get anything wrapped up. But of course, I'm open to opinions here. So.
I'm just looking at the pull request itself, and it's rather sweet. It just, makes it optional. And I think Wouter, said it right. Although not a syntax error, a warning should be given that this block is missing. And that sounds like, I think, what Carsten was saying about the lint versus the validity. So it sounds to me that the copyright issue is a bigger issue, and that actually what we need is some rules about combining info blocks if they are present. And that sounds like SDF next, separate issue to me.
And actually, it's a direct problem, because when you get to this composition of objects into things, there you have it right away. So I think that's a much bigger problem to. I don't know, but I mean, I guess it's a bigger problem.
We're not making it optional. Doesn't eliminate our if it's present, how do you merge it question,
No.
which I think part of the discussion was about. And so whether it's optional or not, you still have to solve that as a separate problem. And that's what I'm hearing, is people are concerned that if it's optional, that we would lose the copyright information and the contributor information. But if someone has put that info block there, then it's there. We still have to kind of figure out how to annoy it. So Carsten, did you just post a new issue? Is that what
Yes.
your 26 is about? Yeah. So you've just captured that. That's wonderful. Thank you.
But assuming that we keep 1 and 2 as we do as we said here, the question is: do we want to add additional things on the scale, main, and max? Do we want to do anything there in SDF 1.1 now, or do we want to? Or do we rather want to wait until SDF next? Ari.
Yeah, I think Michael made a good point about the we still need to deal with merging the contents if they are there. But maybe how we could look at it, if it's optional, now you have a way to indicate, I don't have anything to say here. But if it's required, you don't have this mechanism. You would have to put their TBDs, and then the code would have to figure out if that's what should be there or not. So in that sense, it seems like it's very reasonable to have it optional. And if you have something useful to say it. If not, leave it out.
I don't know if either way, even when it's mandatory or optional, if we should add something to the specification text that this is currently not specified how you actually merge these, and that will be sorted out. So there are no rules yet.
Well, we're not really discussing merging at all, so
no.
Exactly.
Michael, sorry.
Yeah. So I did want to point out that when we did have a few discussions about how the merging would be done, and we didn't really. This was probably even maybe 2019, because it was a face-to-face meeting, And we never really came up with a pattern other than we thought that when a composite definition was created, it would carry all of the copyrights, and when a thing was created, it could indicate which piece was going to which. So it's not a simple answer at all, and I think that the approach is correct, and I agree with all of this, that we don't really have to consider how it's done right now, and I think to make it a SDF.next is fine. And we do have that more work to do. And for now, if you keep the copyright on an original source somewhere, it can always be tracked back. So we can have the tools be a little more loose about that and still have that original contribution, especially if we have the contributor repos. We can keep that copyright information, and we can think about doing the tracking. We haven't done it yet, so we haven't made any mistakes. And maybe there are more comments on this, but I wanted to make a comment on the scale min and max. First, that models that use those will still validate as 1.0, which doesn't really mean they validate, but it means that they have a way of being present without breaking things and still getting flagged as not being up to date. They can also be experimented with as a protocol, as a mapping file entry, and I can talk a little bit more. I have one slide about this scaling as mapping files, so we can experiment with some of the patterns, having them in as extensions without, as you know, custom extensions without having to you know, change the validation, because I think with custom extensions in 1.next, we're looking at things like having extension schemas that can validate just a piece of something that's an extension. So if we do some of that work, this experimentation with new features will get easier to do, and maybe scale min and max and the replacement for that can be our first test case.
Mm. Yep. So I guess what we really need to have a discussion, have a decision on here is if we want to do something before marking 04 with these changes as implementation draft. And on what basically we need to wrap up the call for consensus. So there's a last call on this. And what I hear is that while 2 and 3 here, they are not. There are side effects by doing things, and lots of additional work is needed. But maybe where we are now in this process, it would work to actually do these changes, making info block optional and removing the scale max min, and that will not, and then sort of get going at solving those problems in the next cycle is a good way forward. Are there any objections to that? Are there any? Yeah, we can do a poll, of course. Ari?
Maybe one comment on the third one. Carsten, did you have more detailed slides coming on that aspect?
Yes.
So maybe we could have that after the poll on that one after that part, and then do the one and two. I guess we don't have more details because they are quite straightforward. Do them as a simple poll.
Okay. Okay, then we'll do like this. We will sort of at this point here say, yeah, 1 and 2 are okay, no objections with those, and then we will jump right to Carsten's slides on scale min max and go through them, and after that directly we will jump back to this and make a decision, go or no go as implementation draft. Are there any objections to that? Okay, no objections or nothing. Good. can Michael, can you take us to
Slide 23.
23? Carsten,
Okay, so
please go ahead.
Thank you. This is a few slides that actually describe what we should be doing for 1.next, but of course they also contain information about 1.1. So basically, the important thing to keep in mind is that SDF describes an information model, so it's not meant to give you a way to directly derive instances on the wire just from the information model. You may have to add a mapping file or a protocol binding file, or I think there are other words for these things. So that's something that we want to understand how to do in 1.next. But SDF itself is meant to be the converged, combined information. And different ecosystems, or even different implementations, different instances, may have different digital representations for the same information. So the information model doesn't change, but whether your temperature sensor goes to 800 Kelvin or 1100 Kelvin may be a difference from instance to instance. So the problem we were having while we discussed this during the last 2 weeks was that there's kind of a perception all these JSON schema org derived qualities describe the digital side, so the actual interchange, what's on the wire. But that's actually not what we are doing. We are borrowing those qualities from JSON schema org, but they are not meant to describe the actual on the wire bits. They are meant to describe the information model. And that's generally a likely thing you will find, that because there are few good languages for describing information models, that people are using, abusing, misusing data model specification techniques for information models. And we are guilty of that too. But I think it's not a problem as long as we stay conscious of it. So summary of this slide, the information model is about the physical side and the actual quantities, the physics quantities, and not about the bits on the wire. Next slide. So when we add, can you go to the next slide? So when we add the scale minimum side to the picture, we get this really weird situation where the scale minimum pushes out minimum and maximum from the physical side to the digital side. So either these things change their semantics based on the presence or the absence, or yeah, something is weird here. The SDF model really should be about the physical side. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. And the digital side should be described if it's really common. So for instance, if we had an SDF model for standard definition TV, we could say the scale minimum is, the minimum is, the digital minimum is 16 and the digital maximum is 239, and everybody would agree on that because that's a common characteristic of all standard definition TV formats. But in many cases, that's not the case. There is no single standard digital representation of temperature reading. So that doesn't make sense in the converged model. So normally we will leave the digital side to the mapping file, to the protocol binding. So this picture is wrong. It hurts when you start putting together mapping information and information from the converged model. Next slide, please. So just to give an example, if we have a temperature sensor that goes from -50 to plus 150 degrees Celsius, then maybe, the text is wrong. So then maybe if the sensor actually has one more one more digit after the floating point comma, right? Then it says centikelvins and should say decikelvins. Then the digital number might go from -500 to +1500, or might be offset from that. But this is just the example. So in an SDF specification for this, you would set minimum and maximum to -500 and +1500, because that's what people think these JSON schema org qualities actually mean. And you would set scale minimum and scale maximum to -50 and +150 with a unit degree Celsius. So the digital numbers really should be supplied by the mapping info. So you would, yeah, it's just difficult to get all the cases right. And really the question is which side, the digital or the physical side, gets the JSON schema org keywords minimum and maximum. Next slide. So we looked a little bit through the playground, and as I said, there is currently no scale minimum, scale maximum in there. And people are actually using minimum and maximum for the physical quantities. So in particular, the OCF models clearly are thinking about these as describing the physical quantities. So we didn't complete the survey for all 200 something models, but the conclusion from a survey of the playground was people are already using minimum maximum for the physical side. So the perception that they can be on the digital side actually is wrong. There's one minor issue here, which is that the JSON schema org stuff probably wants to stay within the range of things that are iJSON. You don't have to take it this way, but people's implementations will want to do that. But actually, IEEE 754 has been designed so that for the physical quantities we care about, that's not a problem. So the IEEE 754 has been done by physicists, and they made sure that their quantities actually can be described by 64-bit IEEE 754 floating point. Next slide.
Carsten, just before we go to the next slide, so I think that the connection to JSON schema org part has to do with, for instance, if you are trying to set filters or other kind of constraints, you now have to set them on the physical values rather than the digital values. Is that the point?
Well, the point is that people have been using them for the physical side. So that's what we find in models. So the perception that they are actually meant for the digital side, that only came in when we tried adding scale minimum, scale maximum, because they are on the physical side. So scale min, scale max are trying to push out minimum and maximum from their physical position into the digital position. And that's the dissonance that we have here.
Right, okay.
So yeah, thank you. So the picture that I think we should have for 1.1 is having a big hole in the part that's marked yellow here, or orange. And the things that are defined in SDF 1.1 are interpreted as being on the physical side. And we attack the whole problem of digital mappings in 1.next, maybe by adding digital minimum, digital maximum, or scale offset, or both. Scale offset are defined in RFC 8798. So sometimes the one thing is the right thing, sometimes the other thing is the right thing. So probably we will add both, but we can discuss this in the development of 1.next. So that's essentially my summary slide here, and this makes clear what we should do. If you just jump quickly through the next 3 slides, I actually created some slides for what we have to do the other thing, and it's not something I want to do before 1.1. And if you go back to slide 27, so this is consistent. This is described in SDF today. It's not really a change. It's just acknowledging that pushing in scale min, scale max is creating problems that we don't have to have for 1.1.
Okay, thank you, Karsten. Michael Koster, I saw you had a word on the queue there.
Thanks. My comment was that in thinking through this a little bit more and looking at some of the examples, I think we have more discussion to do. But I think a flavor of what I'm thinking is now in SDF, we have this description of the physical quantity. So that's really scale minimum and scale maximum. I mean, in an ideal world, I think what we'd have would be not even confusing things again with the JSON schema, because we pretty much have a bit different concept on both ends. We're separating the number. And in an actual system, we might have the SDF file having, let's just say, quantity minimum, quantity maximum. And then the protocol binding might have a data schema element that would have JSON schema minimum and maximum, which would be digital minimum and maximum. But if I want to use it in a JSO validator, I'm going to actually have to feed it the string minimum and maximum. So at some point, it gets converted into that. So anyway, I don't really have a conclusion there. It's just that maybe even reusing JSO for the physical is, maybe we wouldn't really need to do that, and we can invent some new terms for that. But I think that's all SDF.next.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I mean, there is yeah. I mean, I still think that we should do we would really like to have SDF 1.1 done, right? And Karsten, do you think that with the change you're proposing, or you and Michael proposed, we are kind of we can postpone this problem until SDF 1 next, and then everybody can be happy with that?
Yeah, so we are essentially not changing the way people have been using these things, but we have gathered enough information where we want to take this in the next round.
So with that, I suggest, should we make we can of course do a poll on this, but it seems like there has been no objection so far, making this complex. I don't think we will get any substantial results. Is there anyone who wants to object to just folding in what Karsten originally proposed on number 3 here on the scale max min, and basically do these things there, these sub bullets, and then we can sort of with that wrap up SDF 1.1. Any objections to that? These are the final call for objections for this. So are there any objections or need to discuss more? Please let me know. Okay, good. Then I think we are okay with the 3 items here to merge those with 03, publish 04, and then 04 will be the implementation draft. So that is the plan. Good. Any final comments from anyone on this? Because if not, then we can move on with this meeting. Then we have an SDF 1.1, very close to being done.
Milako needs to add a button where you can make little hearts stream out, like on Facebook.
I was thinking that too. And we can under a GitHub comment, GitHub issue comment, you can make these thumbs up and so on things, and you should be able to do this in MeetEcho.
Yeah, click show friendly support button. I mean, that's good. Great, thank you. But then I think we are done with this. We have way forward for SDF 1.1, and we are very close to wrapping it up. So that's really, really good. When Karsten and Michael, when do you think you can have a 04 under? When do you think we can implement all these things around-ish?
I think it will take another hour or so. So I just merged the first two pull requests, merging the third one. And I probably will be distracted from regenerating a version, but expect a dash 04 in the next break.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for doing all this. With that, the next thing for us is actually to discuss where we go next. Wasn't there one thing on next? We can take the next interims later. Wait a minute. We, as we said all the time here, and we said in the consensus call for 1.1, was that we definitely are looking to add new features to SDF, and sort of to make it really fully baked when we have an RFC in the not too far future. And as part of that, we have had discussions on what new features that would be relevant and what kind of issues, and I think we just came up with this discussion on the info block that is definitely something to include, and the SDF max and so on. So the scale max, scale min. But in addition to that, there were a number of things that we had discussions on last week in the that have been cooking a bit in the background for some time. And so what we have here that we'll go through today are basically 3 topics that should be probably be included in a later version of SDF. Clarification of properties, actions, and events. And Michael will talk about. Karsten will talk about that. We will say a few. Michael Koster will say a few words about mapping files, and then we have compact format, which is another representation of SDF. With that, I think we can continue. We have over an hour left, but maybe, I mean, since we have a bunch of slides, save some time at the end for. Actually, I think we should take discussions after each topic for a limited amount of time. So let's get going. I think, and then maybe we should discuss the virtual bin interim at the very end of our meeting here. So I will. Yeah, as we get close to the end, we'll get back to talking about when we will have our next interim. So please, next slide. And next slide. And so here, Karsten, please go ahead.
All right, thank you. So as I said, we had a lot of discussions in the last 2 weeks, starting from the hackathon. And I would like to go through 2 issues here. Next slide, please. 2 areas of development. These are not issues. These are just things we need to keep in mind, that we need some active attention on them, both in the way that we interpret what we have in 1.1, and in the way that we further develop this in 1.next. So this is not about any further text changes. This is about understanding what we have and developing from there. So we already talked about data items versus physical quantities. I don't have to repeat that. So let me just talk about number 1, the properties, actions, events. Next slide, please. So the summary information, and it's really the whole thing in one slide. You don't really need to know much more about them. Is that a property is an affordance that has, if writable, the ability to put in a data value, and if readable and or observable, it has the ability to obtain a data value. And the types for putting in things and for pulling out things are the same. Well, at least right now they are. I think we all have experienced the situation where we actually would have wanted to have a different type on a put than on a get, because there is some information in the structure that actually is only readable and only parts are writable. And that's maybe something we need to look at in the next version, but that's fundamentally what a property is. So how this reading and writing is done, whether that's done in a REST protocol or in a message queue and so on, that's not really the interesting thing. The interesting thing is we have a state that is associated with that property that typically maps to a physical state in some form, and that is writable and or readable. And we have these 3 bits, I call them RWO bits, that we can use to say what exactly we have here. So there are 7 meaningful combinations of those. That's a property. An action is something quite different, because it really isn't about a state. It's something you can throw input data at, and then something happens on the physical side, and then the affordance generates an output type. So some people think about this as an RPC. That's certainly an abstraction that comes to mind. But I think it's a little bit different from an RPC, but that's a detail we maybe don't have to discuss today. But in any case, it's not a state that you, for instance, can cache in a proxy cache, or that you would want a broker to supply as a last wish element or something like that. It's really something you can do. So making a coffee is something that's my typical example for an action. So that making a coffee actually might create some state temporarily, but after you have made the coffee, the action is over. It's no longer something that's in there. And the third thing we have is the event. And that's interesting because it's something that puts out data of a certain type. And it actually is not that much different from a property, except that we don't say whether getting that object needs to be solicited, which would be the readable part of a property, or actually is autonomously decided by the thing just sends something which would be the observable bit. So that's just not defined about events. The only thing we have defined about events so far is that they throw some data at you. And that's not different from a property. So that's the underlying observation. Next slide. And the problem that the industry has is that there are very different concepts that are typically mushed together under events. So if you think about events in the way XMPP or MQTT or whatever would think about messages, that's certainly one way to think about it. But going a step away from the protocol, if you look at the physical example of a doorbell, that's actually the main affordance of a doorbell is an event. So, for instance, you don't change the state of the doorbell by pressing it, but pressing it once or twice are actually different. So the events are countable. It's not just the data, it's the actual existence of the event that contains part of the information. So that's one example. And another example for an event that's not yeah, that's a little bit more on the business side, but it's still quite pertinent, is a sale. So a sale is another event that comes with data. For a sale, you want to know where to ship that thing and how many of them and so on. But the important aspect about this event is that it must not be lost. So some other properties, if a temperature sensor gives you some readings and you are missing one, that's not a big problem if you get the next one soon. But a sale is important on its own. And it comes with data that are only about that specific event. So the next event you get is not going to repeat anything about the previous sale. It's just a completely new event. So I think we should focus our discussion on events on what I'm calling a genuine event here, and we probably have to evolve some terminology. There's nothing wrong with 1.1 as it is. It just doesn't tell you what kind of event we expect to describe with the SDF event affordant. Next slide. And just to contrast that, non-events, so things that are really more on the property side are, for instance, a temperature sensor with a threshold alarm. So the temperature sensor has a current value, and that can be read, and it also has a notification function. So if a threshold is crossed, you get a notification, and that's exactly what the R and O bits of a property do. So it's not an event in the sense of an SDF event. It's certainly an event in the sense of the English language meaning of event. Now, the interesting thing where we have a crossover here is that there are some properties that actually need to have a history about state changes. So you may have a legal obligation to record the instances where the temperature sensor crossed the threshold. And we need to model that. And that's really something that we should take up as an item for the 1.next activity. I think that's a problem that's solved very well in no of the existing environments, and we might have a chance to actually model this properly. Next slide. So with that, I think we also have a fresh look at the SDF property and the observable bit. As I said, we have 3 bits with each property: readable, writable, observable, and actually all default to true, which maybe spec writers don't have in their minds. Michael, did you say something? You're muted.
I have a child trying to communicate with me.
I can't hear you. Okay, thank you. The problem here is that some of us are pretty imprinted by CoAP, and when we read the word observe, we think about a GET request with an observe option, but that's not what is meant here by observable. So the observable bit does not imply readable. It just means that property is going to send you notifications, and the perception that observe implies readable is not what's in the document. So there's no need for a change here. It's already in there, but you have to read it properly. So given that these 3 bits are independent, this means that actually a property that is --O or no read, no write, but observe is possible. It's observable but not readable. And in the discussion we have had the term notifiable. I don't know if we need another term here or not. Let's find that out. But the point is that --O already has been part of SDF all the time. We just seem to have forgotten that a little bit. So many of the pub sub style affordances actually are SDF properties in that sense. So we can model this today. Next slide. Yeah, and that means the SDF event should not be used where we have an observable property, and the one.next work is about preciousness and queuing issues, overload issues, what Go ahead.
Or
Go ahead.
there were some audio issues. I don't know if can you just like 30 seconds back or something? I think we lost you.
Yeah, we have some interesting DOS issues right now here.
Oh, okay.
I'm running into those about once a day.
Okay.
Okay, 30 seconds back. Can you go back one slide?
I think there was on this slide, so maybe this you can just go through this again and then.
Okay.
Oh, no, the previous one on the. Go back on the event, SDF event.
Yeah, slide 21.
Now we lost
Sorry.
Michael.
What?
Can you step back
Slide 21,
one slide?
please.
That what you want?
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is essentially just a repetition of what I said, but distilled to a program. So given that an event is essentially defined with the same signature as an observable property, we should try to understand when an event is a genuine event and when it's an observable property, and we should not describe events. I can share my slides if that helps.
Michael is reloading, so he will be back in a second here. So
Okay.
yeah, keep talking then.
Yeah. So we have a program of work for the one.next cycle where we are going to discuss this whole aspect of preciousness and of queuing issues, overload. So not all of that needs to be in the data model, but I think it would be good to be able to identify in a data model whether events are kind of overtaken by new events or whether events really need to be preserved one by one.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot currently model that.
No.
Next slide. So the SDF action actually looks fine. Maybe it looks fine because we haven't done a lot of pressure testing on it yet. So that's also something we should do in the next round and make sure that the SDF action is working well for us. So basically what's there, I think, works. I would be surprised if we would get significant change there, but we currently cannot model actions that actually spawn new affordances. So when you start making a coffee, maybe you have an affordance to stop making that coffee. But it doesn't mean that you have to shut down the machine or something like that. That just means stop making that coffee, and another guy who also wants to make a coffee still gets to make their coffee. So this is typically modeled by dynamic affordances, and you can actually see an attempt to approach the issue of dynamic affordances in the ACE AIF document, where we are discussing the permissions on dynamic affordances. And I think that might be food for thought. It's not solving our problem here, but it might be food for thought how to handle these dynamic affordances. But ignoring dynamic affordances, I think no clarifications are currently required, and we are fine until we add functionality here.
Can I ask a clarifying here? So example would be, I ask the coffee maker to start making me a coffee, and to do that, it spawns an entire new espresso spout, which has a whole bunch of observable attached to it. Is that an example of a dynamic case?
Yeah, so you would get the an SDF event that tells you about the progress, or an SDF property that tells you about the progress, and that progress property goes away when you are done.
When my coffee's done, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Now the example is not so great actually, because in a real coffee machine you cannot start parallel instances of making coffee. So I probably have to come up with a new example.
Yeah, the example
Tell it's 3D
Michael
printed.
McCool, please.
the example we've seen is cancelable actions. So suppose
Yes.
you start making a coffee, you want to cancel it. You might have an additional set of interactions on that action to cancel it. And on some devices, not a coffee machine, you could have several parallel actions going at once, and you need to figure out which action you're talking about. So one thing we played with is returning a new, thing description in Watt. So you could imagine having a new SDF description just for that action, and then somehow, dealing with that way. But there'd be an instance of it.
Yeah, if you have an example of a machine with cancelable parallel actions, I really would like to learn about that so I can replace my coffee machine example. Next slide. Yeah, I'm done. We had that already.
Okay. Yep. Thank you very much, Karsten. Let's stop here for a minute and see if there are any further questions on this. I think this was an interesting sort of exposition, and as I gather from it, I don't think there is any. What we have today in SDF 1011 is underspecified, if anything, and not very sort of feature-rich functionality-wise, but it's not broken. So we don't have to remove it right away. I think that would be the key thing here. If we know it's broken from the start, then we shouldn't have it. But I guess we can move on with this and make these features richer in the next cycle. Yeah, any other questions, notes, comments on this? Nope. There were some Michael McCool. I saw you made some comments in the chat, but they were maybe covered already.
To ask about was how subscribe, unsubscribe is handled for events. So we have a separate data model for that in web thing descriptions. I think the assumption here is that an action will be used to manage subscribing and unsubscribing. Is that correct?
Karsten, can you?
Well, right now we don't have anything else, so we would use the action hammer. But actually, maybe we want to invent a screwdriver for that.
Michael Koster?
Yeah, I would probably have just said the same thing, and adding that subscribing and unsubscribing might, since they're not really part of the application workflow in terms of responses and things like that, they might belong in a protocol binding as well. So I think there's some interesting discussion around that.
So basically, maybe you have a quality of being cancelable or something like that, and then you have. I mean, you can cancel a coffee machine, but you can't cancel if you fire the missile, then you fire the missile, right? So different actions can be. Maybe that's
The subscription is a thing that is really part of the mechanism for getting data. So it's sort of like canceling and observe. Well, we don't really provide for that as part of the data model. And I think there's more discussion to be had, though. It's not a conclusion on my part at all.
No. But good. But thank you for this anyway. Any other questions? If not, I looking forward to see more of this develop during the next cycle. Should we move on then to next part, which is the mapping files? I think you need to move like 6-7 slides ahead after the yellow ones. Here. Michael Koster, please go ahead.
Okay, good. Please advance to the first. Okay, so the problem we're trying to solve here is that, well, if SDF definitions are protocol neutral, you know, we want to be able to map them to different protocols and storage schemes and what have you. You know, so the best practice for in 1DM anyway is going to be to leave it up to the implementation to decide a lot of things. So these models can be retargeted to different stacks and what have you without overriding things or breaking things. So you can have sort of syntactic interoperability between elements that conform to the same set of bindings, and then semantic interoperability where you have a bridge or some kind of gateway or other kind of adaptation across these ecosystems. So mapping files is kind of a catch-all term for how we separate the protocol independent parts from the implementations. Next slide, please. So basically, it's a mapping file itself is external information that augments the model. Essentially, these are extensions to SDF or additional pieces of SDF that get added on to further customize a model. So the kind of things we do are add qualities like define minimum, maximum, and multiple. We change abstract number to a type number, like we have say this has to be a float, for example. Reserving space. It turns out that, you know, we have enough packed representations. Can that all be handled in the binding, or is that part of a data type augmentation or constraint that we need to add so that the application can unpack things at the application layer? And sometimes that's what happens. I found that out with Modbus, for example. So we also want to be able to have a big enum that defines all the fan modes you might ever want in a fan, but this fan only has 3 modes, and so we have a way to say that. Defaults for values, constants for values that are left open. New qualities like ID codes that are shorthand in protocols to reduce the amount of space the information takes up in the protocol. Custom settings for things. New protocol binding settings. So what protocol does it use, and what parts of the protocol, and how does it use them? Protocol bindings. And then we might want to override things. And obviously, if you make your model saying these are defaults, you're allowing for overriding in the future. But also, we might be able to say, you know, this is an integer in the model, but I want to override it to a float. Some of these things hurt interoperability, so we have to be careful about the overrides. And there are other things you might want to do to models that aren't really considered here, having to do with composition and stuff that I'll talk about a little later. Next slide, please. So the processing model, as I see it, now this is where we sort of get into what's a proposal and what's sort of being worked out, is that there's mapping information for each SDF element. So be it a thing, an object, each event, each action, property, data, and even each category instance in an enum. Each enum value could have mapping. So if I have an enum for, you know, up, down, and center, I might make those 0, 1, and 2 in one ecosystem, and I might have strings in another. So so those need to be mapped. One of the big, SDF choice. We used to call it SDF enum, but it's called SDF choice. Basically, those mapping elements should be processed as if the source file had them, you know, right there in line. And in fact, some of the work I'm doing is sort of, what if you did have them as inline extensions that you could easily split out to mapping files and compose back in. Also, I think a concept is that there could be extension schemas, basically a validation of the extension as an extension that gets validated by a schema you provide. And that might be what we build in as a mechanism for defining extensions. It's really easy if you're putting in a new block, but if you're just adding qualities, it's harder to see how that might work. But it seems like a reasonable direction. Also, the extension vocabularies and what you do with extensions and in mapping files should be able to use what we've already designed in SDF. So SDF ref, required, concepts like that. They should be, for the most part, be SDF files also, but with some other kinds of behaviors. But again, this is sort of a direction that looks promising, but everything isn't worked out yet. Right, next slide, please. So the format of a mapping file is just naively, you could say, well, let's just have a JSON pointer to each place you want to put something in as an extension, and then have the extension described as an SDF type object. And so selectors for places in the file you want to put things, and then the values you want to put there. Selectors currently are JSON pointer that we use, so it should be the same as you use with SDF required, or SDF-ref for that matter, including the namespace. So you should be able to, in your mapping file, say these are my namespaces, and use the query format for that. As an example, if you wanted to take the ipso sensor value and target it to ipso, which was taken out in the model, you would say this is an ID 5700 and it's a float type. And there might be some more things you want to say about it, but that's a simple example. So a mapping file, and there might be more than one mapping file. There might be one mapping file that adds IDs, and another one that adds protocol bindings, and another one that composes things. So there might not be just one mapping file at a time also. Right, next slide, please. So, there are different ways to do it, obviously. You could say that instead of a map, it's an array of objects where the selector is an element in each object and process them in array order, and there may be some advantages for doing that. I also looked at some design patterns that looked more like JSON merge patch, where you have sort of a template that sort of mirrors the structure of the thing you're patching, and you plug things in like as if you were patching a JSON, and that's it sort of would work, but the files look sort of sparsy and spacey and indenty, and it's not really any easier to read than a mapping file of the other form, but it's also a possibility. Also, the selectors could be some other kind of thing like JSON path. So you could say, if I don't really have a JSON pointer for everything, I want to build a mapping file that's a little more generic and adds things or collects node sets from the SDF file to annotate based on a JSON path query. So that could be happening. Also, as I mentioned earlier, beyond just augmentation and overriding and adding qualities, there might be other operations we want to do. I haven't run across any specific examples, but people talk about things. Next slide, please. So yeah, one alternative implementation that I have played with is using an SDF thing as the mapping file. So essentially what this is an SDF thing definition that uses SDF-ref to pull in a bunch of objects, and it also has the extensions in line. So I'm saying, here's a thing that has a voltage measurement and a current measurement, and they use standard ipso objects, and the voltage measurement now has some mapping file information that defines data schemas and protocol bindings for use in the target. So essentially, I want to aggregate a bunch of objects and stuff, and I want to maybe define some new data type constraints and new data elements to use, to reuse, and then I want to customize everything. Just say, well, here's my thing. Here's my power supply. It measures voltage and current, and it has some settings, and it has some alarm events, and it's all described in one place, and that tends to have worked out pretty good for small things at least. And of course, larger things you might want to break them up still into multiple files, but it looks like a good pattern, a good authoring format. If you're just sitting down and writing stuff and not just machine generating everything, this is sort of how you might write a template for deployment of things. Next slide, please. I think I just have a couple of graphic examples. This is really what I was talking about. The example creates a web of things thing description. It has an SDF thing that refers to a bunch of objects and also pulls in some of the Web of Things data schema and what they call forms, which are the protocol binding elements. And so as this SDF thing has the object references and the object customization and the protocol binding information and the over-the-wire schemas. And that can be used to sort of automatically generate the thing description file for you just add the network address and at that point and you have a thing description. There's Juan Carlos in the queue. Question?
Hi, Michael. Thanks. I have a question. I'm trying to figure out from your talk. Let's say that I wanted to have the semantic definition of binary data types on the wire, but for sensors using a binary description, let's say 5 bits for temperature and 11 bits for time. So not byte aligned, but binary random byte number of bits, sorry, used for different things. How do you picture this mapping being worked out for the types?
We have a few examples of the raw models that do that, and essentially it's easy enough to say a packed thing is sort of an array with unique items, and when you do that, you can then size each item by using a numeric range or string constraints so that they fit in the elements you want to pack them in. So that's probably the first thing that needs to be done. If this thing is for packed use, then you might want to define it as having a range of only 0 to 3, for example, if you're using 2 bits. So the bare model is already covered. The way the mapping is done is kind of up to the protocol that you're mapping to. So this is really one of the challenges. So where we have this in Bluetooth now, I think the example, what we have is an additional quality. I don't believe it's in the vocabulary anymore because we didn't really have it fully defined, but it is width in bits. And so you can construct an array of these items in the binding, and you can say the width in bits of it, this one width in bits is 2, this one width in bits is 5, and this width in bits is 1. And then you can put them in an array and pretty much describe the full packing. And I don't have an example of the array binding, I don't think, but that's essentially the pattern.
Okay.
Train the original data so that it fits in the elements you're packing it into, and then you can define the width of each element in an array in the data schema part of the binding that describes what goes on the wire. That way, if you decide, well, I want to expose it as a JSON in my web service, and each one is just a JSON number, string, or Boolean, then you can always map it that way, and the system will know how to repack it and unpack it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So next slide, please. I think we're about done. Yeah, next step. So we have to figure out how the extension schemas would work and how we actually create extensions to SDF that can still be validated. I think that's a good direction to try to pursue, if that makes sense. We need to really do some broad review and pressure test of this. So where we've already done model conversion, we need to look at where people would incorporate instance bindings and mapping files and these extensions for, what did the OCF ones look like? What do the Zigbee ones look like, for example? And then we need to formalize the design patterns once we sort of figure out a set of things that we want to do. And then really for SDF next, we could introduce a couple of concepts like these extension schemas and maybe formats for mapping files. And then maybe some processing model definitions as well. And it occurred to me that at some point we might start looking at making separate drafts for some of this stuff as well, like we did with CoAP. I don't know how well it really worked out with CoAP to have observed be a separate draft, but some of these like mapping files might be a separate draft. Just a question that occurred to me. I don't know if it's a good idea or not. Right, next slide. I think we're about to the end. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So value scaling, we talked about this enough already, but my point on value scaling is probably most of that is going to be done at one time. So Karsten, and we talked about layers and how you might want some constraints at one and then layer on more constraints when you do another thing. But for the value scaling, at least in my examples, it's worked out pretty well to say, well, here's my basic model. It has a number that represents voltage. Great. Here's my protocol binding. The voltage is between 0 and 30 in increments of 0.01, and it has a digital representation of an integer between 0 and 3000, and it has a quantity representation of 0 to 30.00. And I can describe all of that in the binding as an extension. So we don't really need SDF to fix that right away. But I think that having common patterns for doing this, the value scaling, is definitely going to be a big deal for interoperability. And that was all I had. Questions, comments?
Thank you, Michael. Also very interesting stuff, and I think having worked with these translation bits, I think it's a good part to try to align a bit on and work with, because there's a lot of hidden stuff here that makes things, what sounds easy turns out to be pretty complicated to map well. But very good. As we said in the chat, I think it also makes sense to have this as a separate specification from the SDF spec. Karsten? Comment?
Yeah, I think that this was a very good talk. And this really leads to the question, how do we pursue this kind of work? And I think this would be a good time to actually talk about the next virtual interims, because I really wouldn't want this to sit by the wayside for another month before we start continuing work on it.
Yep, we can absolutely take that discussion right now. We have half an hour left, and I think the compact stuff can
Sure.
take at the end. What I mean, one of the things here going into the mapping files is that I think we need to have good understanding of the requirements, what the various ecosystems want, basically. I mean, you had example with IPSO here and the mapping to numeric IDs. We have Wouter in the meeting here as well, so mapping to OCF and so on. But maybe it would be really good to have, so that was what we define here is actually maps well to maybe we should put together some kind of, I don't want to call them use cases, but some kind of template cases that we translate to the various ecosystems that it should work, right? What makes it needed? Yeah, okay. I saw your comment in the chat, Karsten. Yes, for the final specification, yes, but for this work in progress, I think we can start working right away, right? Or what do you mean?
So to my mind, there's three things here that we need to figure out. What bit of SDF next do we need to clarify before we can deal with mappings, and what is the work to generate to build this mapping specification, and then what are the sample example mappings there? And it sounds like we need to do some of this work before we can have a virtual interim to reasonably discuss it. But on the other hand, we don't need to complete all of the work. We just need to get there. We need to get some of the work enough to a point where we can have a conversation about it. Does that sound right?
Yep. Yes, I think so. Michael Koster?
Yeah. One quick comment, that in my work and examples using the Web of Things thing description, it could be as simple as just providing the data schema element and forms element from thing description, because thing description already has a well-structured protocol binding. So I kind of took the easy way out there, but also it's a good starting point. For something like OCF, you probably want to be able to introduce Swagger files and point things to, you know, open API files. So I think, Nicholas, what you just said is, or sorry, what Michael just said is that those three stages, yeah, we need to figure out what are the differences between, you know, the different templates that we use for the mapping, and then really what's the commonality? What's the, is it really just an extension mechanism that you can pass arbitrary stuff through that we don't really define in our own ontology, or is there going to be some kind of common ontology of things that work for all protocol bindings? And I don't think we really have a totally clear feeling about that yet. But Web of Things, each protocol binding is a whole separate vocabulary with its own ontology, and they're all already developing them. So again, it's an easy way. It's an easy way out. I don't know if it's sufficient for everything, but there's some patterns there that are a good starting point.
So I think we should start with putting together some reasonably simple examples of moving from, I mean, what is, so we don't need to expand, so we can basically use SDF 1.1 as it is and don't have to finish SDF next before we sort of finalize things, but we, some simple example using gas properties, for instance. And then try that out and then build on that. So maybe actually doing some kind of more hackathon-oriented meeting would make a lot of sense here, from the perspective of people try this out and sort of can compare notes before you continue. Yep. But so then the question becomes that, right? How do we should we just, because obviously the mapping files is to make SDF useful for your ecosystem, you really need to have this in place. So I guess we need to have a robust understanding of them. Should we start with, should we try to have like an interim meeting like a month from now? Or is that in the middle of Easter? Yeah. Week 15. That translates to week of April 12th. If you start your week on Mondays.
I don't know, my week number's off. I went by and
anyway, so
from what I heard Karsten say, that he didn't want to leave it a month, and that is a month from now. So I thought that he was trying to go for this week here.
If we come up with a specific program for what we actually want to get done up to that interim meeting, maybe even with a little hackathon call in between, I think mid-April might be the right thing.
So you're thinking this week, Karsten, for this goal, but you're thinking about something like a call during this week.
Yes, or the next week. I'm not.
All right, so let's put up a. So you're talking about like 2 or 3 calls, you know, half-hour calls during that week. Is that what you're talking about? Or is that what you mean by
don't
hackathon?
know if we need. Don't know if we need that many.
Like not long calls, like 20-minute long things or something like this.
Yeah, week 13 is a little bit difficult because it has the Easter holidays in it. Well, the Easter holidays begin on a Thursday.
Or did they for you? Okay. Nice.
It's not an official holiday, but
Nobody
it's
shows up.
Yeah. But then the week after Easter, right? Week 14. Sometimes in the middle of that week, perhaps yeah, maybe not the 10th, but the 8th. Let's do a doodle for that, right? So people can check it out.
But we have an approximate direction.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And then do we need to do? So one of the good things perhaps is if because Michael Koster, you had a lot of sort of already thought quite a bit about this. If you want to throw out some kind of straw man proposal or putting together what has been done so far, I mean, very rough, or we can maybe take from these slides or something, and then we can have that as a starting point for the further discussion.
Yeah, I can wrap up what I've done. I don't know if I'm ready to start an internet draft yet, but that's when I thought about how I would wrap this up. That's when I thought about an internet draft. So if I get really crazy, but I think, yeah, the next step would be to sort of make a little bit more of a document out of what we have, and also look at what other people have done. Other folks have worked on the mapping files and have things to contribute that I wasn't able to roll up into my talk today, but for this, I would do that also.
Yep. Great, thank you. Then we have both the way forward on this and the way forward on meeting time, and we have the topic for the next meeting. Great. And there will be a doodle sent out soon-ish regards to next week, regards to this the upcoming interim. Great. Any other questions on this? We have now 20 minutes left of the meeting. We have only one agenda point left, which is the compact format. But any final thoughts and stuff on the mapping? If not, then we yeah, there's a bit of discussion on the chat there as well. Ari?
Yeah, maybe one interesting potential aspect for the mapping that we haven't really discussed yet is being able to express more relationship between objects and things. So right now we have only the hierarchical way of expressing that object is part of a thing. And if you want to say, hey, how these two things or two objects relate to each other, that could also be something that we could be experimenting in the mapping file. So I guess it's just like kind of call for anyone interested in that topic and having perhaps knowledge on how these things are done in perhaps some other ecosystems would be interesting to exchange some notes.
Yeah, very good point. Even though is that really a mapping file problem? I think that feels like a core SDF problem, but I mean, obviously with the implications on the mapping file, but I think that much of this happens in the core bit. Michael Koster?
Just going to kind of plus one and say that this idea of it also has to do with the consolidation. So the thing model that I did that pulls in objects would benefit a lot from having some more annotation that would tell you about how these things work together.
And indeed, it could be separate from the mapping file. I guess it's in general some mechanism, whether in the base SDF mapping file or a third way of doing it. But I think it's an interesting topic to look into.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there were some pointers to cross-links, call-down links, and relationships and stuff. So and I guess we can look at other modeling languages and environments to get even further, even additional, even more stuff in that space. Good. Let's do the final presentation here for today. Karsten on the SDF Compact. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to have this at the end because it's really, I mean, it's more like the dinner talk kind of thing. It's completely optional. It's not changing anything what we are doing. It's not adding semantics and so on. But it might still help us doing our work. Next slide. So the observation is that SDF has been designed and optimized for interchange between tools, and that's actually one of its main unique selling propositions. This is a language that helps bringing different tools together, and that's certainly not something we want to change at all. On the other hand, humans do have to work on SDF models too, and a format that is optimized for tools cannot at the same time be optimized for humans. And that, of course, is not a new thing. That has happened before. And one example that is pretty dearly to my heart is that when XML got a reasonable schema language after the W3C schema disaster, that started as an XML-based format. And yeah, that was the obvious way to do this, because XML is about XML, so you should have an XML-based format describing XML. But people quickly found out that this is possible, but not what you actually want. So James Clark actually defined something called RelaxNG Compact, which was not designed for interchange, but was designed for the whiteboard. So it has less noise and more focus on the substance, and that facilitates human interaction. So given that James Clark has shown us how to do this, the question came up during the hackathon, is there something maybe that can be done with SDF that points in the same direction? Next slide. So I just grabbed a random SDF model from the playground. That's actually a pretty simple model, because it essentially just defines the cycle time, actually the cycle frequency of pedal on a bike or something like that. So it's measured in 1 per minute, in the centimeter unit 1 per minute. And it's not writable, and so on. And there are some ancillary properties here, range and step, which are what you would expect them to be, and only the cadence is actually required. So I think most of us now can read this. Well, maybe it's a little bit small for good eye. It requires good eyesight. But yeah, so I just went ahead and fantasized how should the compact form of this look like, and that's the next slide, which will be familiar to people who were at the hackathon. So this is exactly the same information. As you can see, it now really focuses on the descriptions. Most of the lines are actually description lines now, which is good, because those descriptions are pretty central to the model. But the most of the actual hard information is in the colored parts. I forgot to color the unit. The unit, of course, is also hard information. So, well, we have an info block at the start, which we, of course, want to have. And then instead of having sections, SDF object and SDF property and so on, we just put the kind that is there first. So it's called object. And then the name it's called. And actually, in this case, the SDF object and the SDF property have the same name, which happens a lot. So that's not a problem. It's just a property of that model. So the object cadence has a description, and it has 3 properties which belong to the object because they are indented like this. And the properties actually have some definitional content that is essentially on 1 line each, because there actually isn't more there. That's really all that there is. And the cadence actually has a unit as well. And I probably should have added units to the other things as well, but I just wanted to show that, of course, qualities that are not in that shortcut form can be added just as separate properties. So what does it say? The property cadence is R-O. so it's readable, not writable, but observable. It has an exclamation mark, which means it's required. And the data shape is integer equal or more than 0. So it's a non-negative integer. And the range is readable, observable, but optional. And if it's there, it's an array of 2 integers. And the property is optional again, and it's an integer. So this is really the substance of this specification. Yeah, you can add back all the other things that we want. But the 3 aspects, readable, writable, observable, optionality, and data shape, actually all fit on one line for practically all meaningful models. So this is just an example. I'm not saying that I know how to do all the models in the playground or even the entirety of SDF. So this is just a snapshot. Next slide. So the design here really is to do to be lazy, as good programmers should be. So we let the YAML format do most of the work. For those who don't know that, YAML is widely used as a humane form of JSON, but it goes beyond JSON, so we are not stuck with JSON's limitations. But it's not just translating the JSON to YAML, that's not enough. But it also combines section names and item names into this one label, object cadence or property cadence. We replace the noisy word description by simply a colon. And we merge all this readable, writable, observable, optionality, and data shape information into one line. So that's all there is to the design. And so it was like an hour of work to actually get this coded. Next slide. So just to highlight the places here that actually are changes from the JSON to YAML result coming from the original model. So for me, this works, and it would be nice if other people were looking at this. There was some positive feedback during the hackathon, but of course, I'm really interested to hear about other feedback. Next slide. And my plan is to actually complete the implementation, verify it against the playground models, so we actually know that it round trips on all the playground models, which is, I think, is a very important property of a compact form, and then publish the tool I have started writing and get other people to play with it as well. So from the point of view of this working group, what I think we should do once it's tried out a little bit more and we decide we like it, is this could be an informational document that goes along with the SDF spec, which is the normative, the standards track document. So at some point we might want to decide to adopt it as a working group document, but that's not the situation right now. So I have an initial draft out there, but I think significant work will be needed before we can adopt it. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Carsten. Any comments, question to this one?
From me. So yeah, I was gonna oh, that looks like YAML, and I guess next slide answered my question. It's mostly YAML, but it's not quite. Is it your intention, Carsten, that this be round trippable?
Yes.
From? Okay. That's really all I want to know.
Yeah. Round trippability has significant disadvantages, but I think in this case, it really doesn't make sense to have a compact form that is not round trippable. So there will be some heuristics in the tool that actually creates it. So we will have a standardized way of interpreting the file, but the tool that creates it will have some heuristics to make a nice version of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the round trippability is a necessary feature here, but if that works out, I think this is a really cool thing, or really useful thing, actually. Polycan, exactly as you said, for the whiteboard scenarios and so on. That makes it a lot easier to do things with this, and also reasonably common in our industry to use this way. Anyway, any additional comments, questions? The only risk, as I mentioned, is perhaps that as time progresses, this will overtake the JSON-based format as the kind of sort of normative, or the what do you say, for the adopted models in 1DM and so on, as the golden standard of how you describe things. But maybe that's not a big problem. Okay. Any other comments, questions about the presentations we had today? Michael Koster?
Yeah, just on SDFC, there was the idea of maybe building a visual code or Atom handler that worked sort of like the way the Markdown or ASCII doc handlers work. So you'd have split windows, and if you wanted to actually see the JSON, you could look at it. But if people use that, it wouldn't really be much of an issue as to which was a canonical form, because they would always be sort of parallel from the developer's point of view. You could something wasn't working, you could pull it in and work on it in SDFC and then just spit it back out to your tool chain. That would be the way I would want to use it, and I would definitely use it. I played around with some other sort of text-based simple formats that were not round-trippable, and that was really why it didn't work out. So this is definitely an interesting direction.
Ari?
The way, actually, just to comment on that, the way I use things like that is when I open an SD, let's take an example that I already do today. When I open a CBOR file, that gets automatically converted to YAML. So in the editor, I see the YAML for the CBOR file. And when I write back that YAML file, it's converted back to CBOR. So it's, for me, CBOR is a directly editable format. I don't see in the editor that it's actually binary. So I will not see an sdf.json once this is completed.
Yeah, okay. I also agree on this useful thing to do, especially for editors, human use. But I think the normative format still definitely has a clear role, because that one has better compatibility with variety of different tools out there. Actually, it has been very convenient to work with the JSON format for building a lot of the tooling on SDF, which might be harder with a YAML format. But in a sense, if we look at the YAML format just as a one ecosystem where we can translate to and from, it actually fits nicely with the other set of tools and processes that we are building here. So I think it's actually a good addition to our toolbox in that sense. But I don't see a big risk of it overtaking the normative format.
One thing also perhaps to think about a bit here is the how we code what you say, the special features, so read, write, observable, and so on. And if what is coded to very short form and what is still there. But still, I like this. Anyway, any other final comments, questions on this? So this is, I guess, this is a bit of a, I shouldn't say hobby project, but still very useful stuff. But maybe not the core focus of the group. But please don't, please keep working on it. Anyway, any final comments? Because now we have 2 minutes left here. Michael Koster.
One very brief comment in that I think it's time to put all these tools in one place. Start putting all these tools in one place, so everything can be collected. There's really a lot of it now, and I'm not sure where that belongs, but I think as a topic for between now and the interim, where do we put tools? And maybe just a list of pointers is really all it would take, but yeah, easy thing to do.
We are allowed to include tools into our GitHub organization, I believe. but we can also have pointers in the README in the organization as well.
We kind of had it on one DM, but I think it really belongs with SDF more.
+1. Yep.
Well, thank you, everyone. Get some coffee or something for the next.
Keep you awake.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you everyone for staying around and participating and contributing today. And as we said, there will be a call for a doodle. There will be a doodle for an interim in the near future. And with that, I think we conclude for today on the exactly on
Yeah,
our
thank you to
scheduled
the
time.
chairs for the great time management.
Thank you. That was my plan completely. Take care. Cheers.